Before we jump whole hog into texturing this thing, we need to talk about mapping coordinates, or UVs. UVs, or mapping coordinates, in most 3D applications you would call them UVs. 3D Studio also calls them mapping coordinates. You can call them either one. I'll use that interchangeably. But they're simply a way to have a texture drawn onto a 3D object. So if you have something like it's incredibly easy to visualize with something like a plane. If you have a plane here, this is a 3D object, right? You can move it around, manipulate it. Now if we put a material on that object, look at our material editor here, pick a slot, assign it, and we put a texture map on this thing, a bitmap. I'm going to come down here and I have it's a BMP, so somewhere I have this thing uv.bmp, and this is a little utility map that you can use to visualize a 3D object's UV coordinates or mapping coordinates. So what it is checker, red and green, with a couple little markers on it. It's easy enough. We're going to click the Show Map in Viewport button here so we can take a look at this, and we'll see with this we can easily visualize what this object's UV coordinates are. Now in 3D Studio you actually have three mapping coordinates. You have U, and you have V, and you have W, and those are simply the letters of the alphabet that come before X, Y, Z. So we talked about X, Y, and Z coordinates. Those are coordinates in 3D space. But when we're discussing coordinates in 2D space, or space designed to be mapped onto an object, we say U, V, and W. Now most textures are 2D, and so we only use the U and the V. However, if we use a 3D texture, or if we manipulate a standard 2D texture in certain ways, we can use the W coordinate. So this is a 3D object here, but we need to put a 2D texture map on it. So we need to have some way to specify, well, where does this part of the 2D texture map, go onto the 3D object. And so it uses these coordinates U and V, and U and V simply go from 0, this would be 0, all the way to a 1 coordinate in U, and a 1 coordinate in V, and a 1 coordinate in both. So the UV coordinates, U and V, of this point here would be 0, 0. The U and V coordinates of this point here would be 1 in U and 0 in V, because I haven't gone anywhere in V. Again, here would be 0, comma, in U, 0, comma, 1 in V, and then up here would be 1 in both. And so right in the middle would be 0.5, 0.5. And we can take that plane here, and if we go, and we're going to make it a few more segments, and then if we do add a modifier to it, like a wave or something like that. So if we make this plane wavy, right, our texture is still being drawn on it in the same manner. Any sort of deformations that we do to this thing, the UV coordinates remain unchanged. So even though this plane has gotten a whole lot more 3D, the UV coordinates are still cemented onto each point of geometry. You can also think of this pretty easily if you have something like, if we make a sphere, have that, and then we get the material editor here. We're going to assign this new material to that sphere. I'll map this with a thing, and then choose all formats, and somewhere in here we have an earth. And if I choose the show display in viewport, we have our little earth here. So there is a bitmap. Okay, so this is an image of that map, and that map is essentially, to be applied to a 3D object, we have to unwrap it. And so you can think of coordinate systems here too. We have a coordinate system for the Earth, kind of like UV, but it's latitude and longitude. So you could pick any particular point in latitude and longitude on, let's pick Denver, Colorado, that's my hometown. So you pick any coordinate on this 2D representation of the picture of whatever's the surface of that object, this 2D representation here. it also has a corresponding coordinate on the 3D object. So U and V is a little bit like latitude and longitude, if you want to think of it that way. There's all kinds of different ways to so-called project UV coordinates onto an object. You can do it in a planar way. So if that thing is a plane, you can do it spherically, you can do it cylindrically, you can do it all these different ways. Now, most primitives in 3D Studio, box, sphere, whatever, plane, when you create them, has a little checkbox down here, generate mapping coordinates. And what that will do, well, it will create these mapping coordinates or these UVs for you. And so you don't have to, if you're working with just primitives, you don't have to worry about, what your UVs look like until you start texture mapping it. Maybe you can, alter them a little bit, change them up, whatever you want to do to them. You can modify them at any time, and you can do all kinds of, neat things with them. But for the most part, if you're using primitives, you don't even have to ever worry about it because 3D Studio will generate some UV coordinates that make sense for whatever kind of object it is. So if it's a plane or if it's a sphere, that's very simple. But if you do certain modeling operations, will destroy UVs or kind of muck them up, it will muck up these mapping coordinates. Even if you, like if I take this sphere and I were to go in and modify it a little bit, if I come in here and do, an edit poly operation on this sphere and pick a couple of faces there, let's pick a couple of faces, and then I do something to it, like extrude those faces. Now all of a sudden my mapping coordinates are going to be a little bit messed up. See, it preserves the mapping coordinates here, but it doesn't really know what to do with these new faces that are generated. So if you make modifications to some geometry, you can end up with some kind of screwball mapping coordinates. And that's when you have to go in and edit them by hand. So on our object here, which was, largely made from primitives, let's get rid of these two little guys here. So this thing was largely made from primitives, and so we might be able to get away with not worrying about our mapping coordinates for a large part of this thing. However, certain parts of it, like the walls here, I made from several planes all in a row. We did do something with the wheels, like we made these from a couple of segments of pieces of pie. This frame we took and extruded and beveled and chamfered all kinds of pieces out of it, and so mapping coordinates are going to be a little bit goofy. Things like this is just a box, so that one's going to work out great. That's just a box. These are just hemispheres. So some stuff you have to worry about and some stuff you don't. What we're going to do is texture map this thing, and we're going to, you can do it a couple of different ways. You can make sure that your UVs are all correct first, or you can start putting materials on a thing and see what you need to fix and see what you can get away with. So if you were modeling something to hand off to somebody, you would want to go in and double check, make sure that your UVs are all correct for the entire object before you handed it off to somebody else who is painting the textures for it. But in the case of this object, we're just making it for ourselves, and so we can kind of fix the UVs as we go and put textures on. Now, if you were trying to test the UVs or the mapping coordinates for this object, you could create we already created a material here that had that bitmap on there, just a UV utility map. You can take that and put it on here and make sure that it's shown in the viewport, and then you can take a look at what the mapping coordinates of this look like. Well, you can sort of see that this was made out of a series of planes, so it's all repeated across there. You see, you have one repetition of every map, or of the map along every plane there. So these UVs probably aren't going to work out for that. I want to have this surface act as one big piece. And if we look down here, let's see what else. Oh, these UVs look pretty good because that was just made out of a chamfer cube. These UVs are okay too. UVs along on this little pull there, that seem like they might be okay too. We'll have to look at it a little closely. The chain links are going to be okay. Those are just toruses. This little thing, that might be okay. It depends on how we, what the texture is we want to put on there. But anyway, good form for UVs is to sort of make sure that you've got, that looks pretty good too, is to make sure that they're even and they're spaced out nice and even. You don't have any real skewy parts. The skewiest parts we're going to have are kind of down here on the frame, because that's the thing where we did, a series of bevels and chamfers and things. So some of them, see, they get kind of out of whack here. They get skewed. You want to avoid skewing when you're looking at these little checkerboards. That's the main thing to kind of double check. And here we have on the wheel, we have some real crazy UV errors. This one seems okay, but all the rest of these are real goofed out. So that is something you really want to avoid. If your UV utility maps on there like that, that's not going to work at all. So for the most part, this thing looks pretty good. We're going to make a few simple modifications to it. Let's also have a quick overview of 3D Studio Max's material system. I'm going to cover a lot about the material system as we go, but I just want to give you the basics of this. So you can get to the material system a couple of different ways. Under the rendering menu, you have a menu item for the material editor, but you can also get to it with this little toolbar button here. And you get some menus, some icons surrounding, but you see the two main regions of this thing are these 6 shader balls, or material previews, and then your parameters down here. So if you click on, the next one of these, the parameters of whatever you've clicked on will come up down here. And 3D Studio, by default, has 6 shader balls here. There's actually some sliders, so you can drag over and over and over and get a few more. You can also right-click, and there's some functionality in the right-click menu if you click over a shader ball. And so if you right-click, you can say 3x2, so 3x2, 5x3, or 6x4. There's 24 total material preview slots. So you notice that the scroll bars aren't working anymore, and if I go back to 3x2, I can scroll around this way as well and get access to more. But if you select 6x4, that's all the material previews you have. Now that doesn't mean that there can only be 24 materials in a scene. You can have as many as you want. It's just that you can only really be actively working or previewing in the materials editor 24 at a time. So right click and go back to 3x2. I usually leave it on 3x2. I like to see nice big balls. So if you have some object in your scene, let's just make something and put it in there. It doesn't matter what it is. And I want to take this material and assign it to that object. I have this button here, Assign. But I can also take it and drag and drop it on an object as well. And 3D Studio is great because as you're dragging and dropping, it'll tell you with a little tooltip there what it's about to drop that material onto. And then when you've assigned a material to something in the scene and that thing is selected, you'll get these little white corners in the shader ball, in the material preview. If I unselect it, you'll see that the corners are still there, but they're kind of grayed out. So it just means that something is assigned, but it's not currently selected. That's selected. Now, down here you have the parameters. Right here you have the name, so you can call it whatever you like. So if we call this something, then we can edit the parameters of this. You can leave them the default names, but it's a good habit to get into naming them correctly. I'm naming them what they are. So you see some basic parameters here. And this, what we're working in right now, is called a standard material, and it says so over here. Right next to the name, this is the material type. If I click this button, it'll come up with this material map browser, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but you can change the material types to various kinds of things. But the standard material in 3D Studio is quite rich, actually. So in the shader basic parameters, you can actually switch the standard shader from several different shading models. There's anisotropic, there's blend, there's metal, multilayer, Ornayer blend, Phong and Strauss and translucent. So each one of these primarily have different specular qualities or specular components, with the exception of Warren-Nair. That's a different diffuse model, and one that's good for things like paper or anything at all that has a roughness to it. In order to see the effect of this, you have to turn on a little bit of specularity, which is basically the shininess of the thing. And so you have a level, that's how much, how bright it is, and then a glossiness, which is how sharp the little reflection is in there. And if I change this to these different shading models, you'll see anisotropic. What it does is it takes that specular highlight and lengthens it in one direction. It's not isotropic, it's anisotropic, meaning that it has it's stretched in one direction versus another. And so you can see here you have a slightly different specular preview, which as you increase anisotropy, the highlight is spread or narrowed in one direction more than the other. And you have a slightly different preview here. This is specular direction in one, or specular size in one direction, and this is in the other direction. So if you switch it back to something more isotropic like Phong or Blinn, you see you just have a little graph. But this graph in either Phong or Blinn represents the way in which that specular highlight will fall off. And so this represents a brightness, and this represents a size. And so you can see that you can imagine that that little graph represents this highlight. So you can switch among these shading models. For intro, we're going to use primarily Blinn. We can discuss other shading models when you get a little bit more comfortable with everything. And you have a couple other parameters here. Diffuse is the color of the thing. So if I wanted to make, red plastic, let's say, I just switch that to red and have a high glossiness and a high specular level, and I could have red plastic. And now if I wanted to be more along the namesake, I could switch this over to a metal shading model and change some of these other parameters up. So metal shading model, you see how that specular is slightly different. It does different things. Now it can even have a really funny curve there, which would make it kind of more satiny, which incidentally metal is also good for. So if I wanted to have some, I could make this more of a brassy color and change the look of that a little bit. But let's reset that. So if I hit this delete button, I can ask me a question here. If it's used in the scene, so do you want to affect it in both the scene and the editor slot, or only in the editor slot? This button will get rid of it in just what it's asking you in either the scene, so get rid of it on that object that it's already assigned to, or just get rid of it in the editor slot. Let's affect it both, and that way I can reset this thing, and it's also resetting it in the scene. Now you see each one of these colors or these values has a little box next to it. If I click that little box, it will come up with a thing called, again, the Material Map Browser, and it'll allow me to pick some kind of map that I'm going to map it to. These are basically either bitmaps or 2D or 3D procedural textures. Procedural textures meaning that they are things like noise or checkers, some kind of image that is generated parametrically or procedurally based on a function. And if I map it to a bitmap, it'll come up with a file requester. And I can map it to something here like, some Rust, let's say. And then when I do that, it comes into this new attributes, and these are attributes of that bitmap. So you see there's the name. I can affect a lot of properties about this bitmap. But let's go back to the main material. I can do that a few different ways. There's a little button here, which goes to the parent, whatever this thing is assigned to. There's also a drop-down box, which will allow you to navigate through your material. There's also a material map navigator. If I click on that, this will show me the hierarchy of where I'm at. So I can click on this, and it'll go back to the parent. I'll go to this, and it'll go to the map that is mapped to that material type. And I can look at all of these things and get little thumbnails for them as well. But this is a handy way because this shows you the relationship. Because you can have things mapped to things mapped to things and have a fairly dense hierarchy. Well, but these little buttons, these little blank buttons, and when I have something mapped to it, you see an M gets drawn in there. These little blank buttons are actually shortcuts to this maps section. So if I open that map section up, you see I can map things. I can map bitmaps or procedural maps to a number of different things, more things than are up here. There's more things that can be mapped. So you come down here, and you can also map something in this way too. You can click on one of these buttons, and it'll come up with the same requester, allowing you to map something to any one of these things. And now I can choose to disable that at any time if I want. I can leave it in there, but then I can disable this map to see, well, if it is doing something that I don't want it to do, anything like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to increase the specular level of this thing to give the rust a little bit of specularity. I can make the specular a color if I want to. So if I wanted to have that specularity get influenced by some colors, if I wanted to give it a little warmish value. Most things don't have a lot of color to their specularity. Some things do, primarily metals do, but you don't usually want to go overboard with color on specularities because a lot of times it can make things look metally that you don't necessarily want to look metally. So we click OK. And then we come down here, and I'm going to map another parameter called bump. Bump makes things look bumpy. Pretty simple. So I'm going to click this map button here, and I'm going to map it to noise, and click OK. Now what you'll see is even in the little shader ball, it's actually drawn it so that it is starting to look bumpy. There's a size to noise. There's a whole bunch of parameters to noise, but the noise size is going to affect how large the scale of the noise function is. So the bigger it is, the bigger it is. I don't know how else to say it. The smaller it is, then you get these smaller little bits of noise, a more pebbly type of noise. So then if I navigate back up through here, I'll see now I have color mapped and I have bump mapped. And with bump, you can raise this value and make it even bumpier. And then 3D Studio's material editor is awesome because if you right-click it, the default behavior actually is that if I drag this thing, I can either copy it to a new material slot and have a copy of it, make changes to it, or tweak it from there and have a new material, or assign it to something like I showed. But if you right-click it, you can change the functionality of what happens when you drag. So if you change it from drag copy to drag rotate, then what it allows you to do is rotate the material ball right in there, the little shader ball. And it really gives you a good sense of what the specular does. So if you're, not really too sure if that's going to work well, like maybe I want to increase the level and decrease the glossiness if I want it to be more of a glossy type of a thing, then as I rotate this little shader ball around, I really get a sense of how that material is going to look on something. I love this, and it really helps you when you're doing your materials work. And I haven't seen too many other applications with this kind of interactive functionality. Now, the last thing I want to talk about right now is that the last button here is this button called Show Standard Map in Viewport. And this material is assigned to this sphere, so I can tell that by it's selected and it's got the little triangles. So when I click this, Show Standard Map in Viewport, what that does is in the view, it actually puts the texture on there and draws it on for you. So you get an idea of what this looks like on your actual object. Now, it being a sphere, it doesn't really, it looks a lot like that. In fact, it doesn't even look quite as good because in here, it's not really going to render quite as accurate as here with bumps and speculars and everything. It'll kind of try to draw the spec, but the bumps are something that it's not really doing just yet. So if I hit delete and put this on a teapot, and so I hit assign, then you can sort of get a sense of what it looks like on a more complex object, and maybe it's not quite what you thought, or maybe it's perfect, but you get a real idea. And they're pretty high res. They're not quite as high res as the actual images themselves, but this is another area in which 3D Studio excels above most other 3D apps, is its viewport display of textures. A UV layout is mine, and I think probably most everybody's most hated step of 3D work. But fortunately, Actually, 3D Studio makes it really easy. It really does. There's almost nothing easier to UV map in. And especially when we're working on something relatively simple like this, where we can get away with these UV, as I called them before, so-called projections, where we take a certain piece of this and we project it according to what its general shape is. So something like this, the sides of this, we would do what's called a planar projection, where we take the whole side of this thing and project it just in one direction, as if it were a plane on the side of this, and we do another one here, one for the top. There's also a thing called box, where if the thing looks as this does, generally like a box, you can do a projection where it projects in six ways, shaped like a box. You can do something like this cylindrically. This is generally a cylinder, so this would work pretty well to map cylindrically also here. So you could roughly, match up the, what kind of shape the thing is, and then there's a UV projection that works okay for it. Now, something like this is a little bit more complex shape. You would have to take each and sort of portion of this and map it one by one, do the UV layout for it one by one. And then when you get into more complex things like figures or monsters or whatever, something that's far more organic than that, you would there's a process you can go through called UV unwrap, which again makes it so much easier than it used to be. It used to take so long to UV something complex because there was just no good tools to do it. But now we have this technique called UV unwrapping. It's something we can talk about down the road in a later lesson, UVing something more complex. Right now we're going to stick with this. We'll get through the basics here. Stick with this and start putting some materials on here and textures. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take the biggest piece of this. So I'll take that. I'll go, I'm not going to ungroup it. Right now I've picked it as a group, so I have all these different pieces within it. And I don't want to put the same material on all of these things, so I'm just going to open it. And a little corners turn pink to show me that that is a group, which I can still pick by picking on the corners, but now I can pick the pieces of the group. So here I have the main shell of this trailer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open Material Editor here, and I can grab one of these slots and put that material on there. So it turns gray, and I want to, with my materials, I want to, try to name them appropriately. So what I'll do is take that shell, and I'm going to map the diffuse. So I have my Material Editor here, diffuse slot. This little thing is a shortcut to map it. No map currently. Now, with 3D Studio, there's tons of maps that you can use, right? There's tons of different map types. There's bitmap, which is going to be black here to try to give you a preview of what it's going to look like. There's cellular, which is a fractal noise. There's checker. Okay. There's, let's see what else. Composite, which will allow you to layer a couple textures. There's dent, another noise type, and a bunch of different kinds of maps. These ones that aren't bitmaps, almost every one of the rest of these are what are called procedural. So splat and stucco and swirl and tons of really useful ones. Getting something really nice with these can be tricky. It can be done. And they're really useful. Tiles would be a great one to use because then you can, if I map tiles to this thing and turned on the display in there. Now they have some actually interesting preset types of tiles here, so you can say, is it a running bond? Is it a stack bond? You can do bricks and things like this, and you get a preview of it in here again. So however, whatever the ratio of the, preceding row of bricks is to the next row, they have different names for them. So, so you can use those to do bricks, and then if you map one of these, one of the colors with one texture, you can have a grout, you can have a color. It works pretty well. But in order to use these effectively, you really do have to layer them up really nicely. So it can be tricky. Right now, what I want to do is I'm going to start out with bitmaps because they're the most straightforward right now. It's going to give you the best result for right now. Here we go. I've mapped that to tiles. Now if I want to get rid of tiles and map it with a bitmap like I'm going to do, so I would take this, take any one of these slots that say none, click drag and move it up here, and it will get rid of tiles. Alternately, if I had that map to tiles or whatever again, and I wanted to just simply replace it, I can actually click on this button here, click on that, click on bitmap, and then I'm going to select the map that I want. So right now I have this this one, where did it go? Trailer panel right here. And then it will replace it out with that. All right, so now we have our bitmap, and then we hit this button, Show Standard Map in Viewports, and we can see what it looks like on there, get a little preview. And what it is this is that case of where it's simply way too repeated, because I built each one of these panels out of a separate and distinct row of polys, and then attached them all together. So I'm getting a repetition of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever. And that's not what I want. So what I want to do is I'll close this for now. And now I need to actually change the coordinates of this thing to more to match what I want it to be. So I want that bitmap to just get laid on there, in its entirety here. So I take that thing, editable mesh, and I'm going to modify it. Now, unfortunately, you can't see the bottom bit of this menu goes all the way down. There's all these modifiers pertaining to UVs. There's unwrap, UVW map, mapping add, mapping clear, and transform. Right now I'm just going to use the simplest one here called UVW map, and this is the one that contains most of the things that I'm going to need. So when you add that modifier right here, UVW mapping, you see the parameters, you see mapping. These are the different types. And 3D Studio is cool because it shows you what the type is. It has a little gizmo here, like with most things, there's a gizmo. And so if I open this up, I'll see the gizmo, and then as I move that around, it's not doing anything if I move it in X because it's projected on along X. But anyway, if you move it in Y, you can see what it's doing. It's translating the map around. So I could move it in Z and Y here, and I could move the map around and position it exactly where I wanted it on that object. You see what happens though is it fits it. So usually you want to UV map and encompass the whole thing. For starters, we can adjust the positions of things later. But this one is giving me, just without doing anything to it, a pretty nice layout on the side here. All right, so now I didn't really have to change anything. Now you can see though, let's just look through some of these other types. There's cylindrical, and so it's going to look like a cylinder. It draws it like a cylinder, which is nice. You can immediately tell what style of UV mapping you've put onto your object. So cylindrical doesn't make a lot of sense for this. There's spherical, which projects it as if it were a sphere, like that Earth example. Shrink wrap is a little bit like spherical, but what it differs from spherical in that there's only a single pole around the back of it. This doesn't have two poles, whereas a spherical map is a little bit, if you had a piece of candy and wrapped it at the top and the bottom, a little round piece of candy. Or shrink wrap is more like if you had that piece of candy, you set it in the wrapper and wrapped it, pinched it all into one, and pinched and twisted it all into one point. Now there's also a box, which could work for this object. I'm not going to use this at the end of this object at the end of the day for this, but it could work because it projects one copy of that image along all 6 axes of a box. So there, and there. And box probably could work if we rotated this thing around. So we'll try that in a sec. If you have face, which definitely don't want in this case, it maps one copy of the image to every single face of the object. Useful for some things, not for this. And this XYZ to UVW, this is for 3D procedural textures, sort of sticking them to an object and sort of stamping them down. So either planar, if we did planar, we would have to map each individual face of this thing. So we say, this one, okay, that's fine. It also works for the back side here. It works for either one. And you can see the defaults worked out pretty well. All right, so it just projected along that plane and is sitting there. Although it's a little bit taller here, and I want to make sure that it's also going all the way down to here. So I want to come down here and hit fit. Now when I hit fit, it's going to shrink down to the size in both dimensions of whatever you have picked. So it's going to kind of auto fit that projection, which is what I want in this case. Now, if I want to go ahead and map the front and the top and the bottom, etc., I can go ahead and I go back up to the stack and I add another UVW map modifier, and then I have yet another planar mapping picked, but this time it's doing what it had done before, where it's sort of mapping along this, along X here. In this case it says Z, that's probably just because that's the, yeah, our coordinate system was set to view, so the view coordinate is X, but the actual local coordinate of the object is Z, which is why it's Z here. Now what you can do is you can set that projection axis to be something else. So if we wanted to project the front and the back side, we would project it along X. So we click X, and then it's projecting that. But what we've done is we've actually stamped over our other UV mapping modifier. That's because you need to pick the faces before you do it. If you apply this modifier, it's going to apply to the whole object. So what we need to do, we need to get rid of that. We need to go over here. We need to hit, we can do Edit Mesh or Edit Poly, either one. Let's do Edit Mesh. And we're going to pick some faces. So we'll go and look at either edged faces is fine. I want to make sure I pick the front and the back faces here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag a box around here. I have the front faces. If I hold down Alt, drag again, I can deselect faces, so I have just the front. Now I'm going to hold down Control and pick the back. Okay, so I have almost all the back faces picked. Hit Control and add to the selection. Then I'm going to hold down Alt, drag, and subtract those out. So now I have all the faces, they're red there, all the faces that I want to do that mapping modifier on, and I'll go down and pick UVW map. And so now it's the same thing again with we're going to need to change the axis. I'm also going to turn off edged faces. Edged faces helps when you're picking faces, but can get in the way if you have a dense object and you're trying to visualize the textures on there. So we're going to go down here and we're pick X. Okay, so now we have it's gone along here, gone mapped along there. We just have to do the top and the bottom. What we can do is we can manually move around that little gizmo. And so, as I did before, you can move this around. We want to make sure that we hit fit. It's usually a good practice to hit fit. That will automatically zoom it to the extents of of whatever you have picked, the whole object or individual faces or whatever. And then we can also rotate it around. So we can rotate the UV map coordinates, and that will allow us to say, oh, I want the flow of it to go this way or the other way or whatever. So you can make manual changes to it as well. The other thing that you can do is you can use this tool called Normal Align. So if this weren't, let's go back to, if this weren't aligned correctly, like right now it's projecting this way, we could use this tool called Normal Align, and then we pick on a face. By picking on a face, you align the map to whatever direction that face is pointing. This is an incredibly handy tool. I use this all the time, this Normal Align. In fact, I use it more often than changing the alignment, because a lot of times it's kind of easier to just hit that tool and normal, click along there, and then hit fit again. And then that will, more often than not, give you a really nice UV layout. So let's take that and let's see if we over here and render it real quick, get a sense of what that looks like. All right, pretty good. But we're probably going to need to edit the material just a little bit. So go back to the material, grab that. And down here, maybe we want to add a little bit of bump map to it. So if we take this slot, drag, drop it on bump, and we say instance or copy. In this case, we can do an instance, that's fine. If we wanted to change some of the parameters of the bitmap itself for each individual channel, we'd hit copy and then we could make those changes, but instance is fine. And so, very good, bump of 30. Let's see if that gives us anything. It's given us a little bit. It's probably, I don't want to over bump stuff. Too much bump is, kind of something that will make something look very 3D-y, and that should be a very subtle bump on that. So, okay, perfect. Very good. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in. I'm going to do it kind of the other way around. I'm going to create a generic material. So I'm going to call this, be trailer generic or generic paint or something like that. And then I'm going to map this with a bitmap. And let's say all formats. One of the funny thing about, actually annoying thing about 3D Studio is that whatever the last type of image that you picked, it defaults to files of that type. So you go, where's my files? You always have to come in here and click all formats. It's actually kind of obnoxious. But at any rate, so say, okay, well, there's a paint texture. And the cool thing about 3D Studio, though, it makes up for that annoying thing, is that you have a really great preview in here. You can preview it on a ball. Okay, so you can rotate around. It'll make a nice rendered preview for it. You can preview if you click over here, as a little flyout that'll let you preview on a cylinder, let you preview on a box. So you can actually do a lot of materials work in here. Let's go back to sphere. Kind of it's the best one for visualizing what some specs look like and stuff on it. So if we look at this thing, I love this. I love it. I wish other 3D apps had this because it really does help. You kind of get a sense of what your material is looking like. So I choose to show the map in the viewport. I'll know that I want that a little later. And then go down to maps, and I'm going to do that copy to bump thing. That's a nice, with an instance, that's a nice quick way to get a bump map. Now, it's not always going to work. There's a lot of cases in which you are going to have to use a tailored specific bump map. A lot of cases. But for this, it's going to work out pretty good. So now we can get a sense of what that looks like bumpier. Okay. Let's see what else. So if I want it to be, sort of painty, I'll take up the spec level. So now you can see what that's kind of doing, giving a little bit of shine. Specularity is the shininess of the thing, and so specular level is how much, and then glossiness is how broad it is. So you can have something that's really, really glossy, and you can see it kind of, the edges of the bump get highlighted as well. So that's good. Now, if we wanted to do this right, we're probably going to want to adjust this a little bit, see how it's shiny inside where it's cracked, where it's sort of scraped off as well. Maybe we don't want that. So we're going to need another map. Now, we could probably use a copy of that same map, but if you put a copy of that same map into specular level, for example, then since the luminosity of this map is fairly equal, this isn't that much darker, we need to do one of two things. We can make a separate maps in Photoshop. So if we go to Photoshop and we have this map open, we can go and if we look at the levels of this thing, actually first of all, let's make it black and white. So we can either go hue saturation, Control U, or you can go to image adjustments, desaturate. That'll take all the color information out. And if you go to image adjustments, levels, then what you can do is you can make this thing a lot more contrasty. You can also use these little eyedroppers here. So you can click this eyedropper. This will set the black point. And then this will set the white point. So you make that a lot more contrasty that way. So now we have black and white where that thing is, where in those areas where we don't want it to be shiny. So we can save this under images here. That's fine. Trailer paint. I'm going to call this trailer paint spec because it's a spec map. Hit OK. And we'll minimize Photoshop there. And let's see. So we have our spec map, we're going to put it into spec level. We're going to pick a bitmap, and we're going to pick that. So that was a paint spec right there. So now what it's doing is it's not letting it be shiny in those bits where it's rubbed off. And that'll give us a way more sort of realistic result. So I think that's a little bit too shiny overall. So I can take, if I take spec level down to 0 here, it's a little bit weird the way 3D Studio works. The best way to do this is to set the spec level to 0, and then you can dial it down this map. So as you're dialing this map down, now your spec level is going to drop the amount of it. But if we had spec level set to something high here, that would overtake it. So the best thing to do is set the spec level to 0, and then adjust the amount that this map is influencing right here. So I'm going to come over here and we'll drop that spec level down like that. I'm going to come back up here, and the glossiness, we're going to let it be not quite so shiny. All right, so good. Now we're going to I'm going to pick just a couple of things that feel like that generic thing can be assigned to. So I'm going to take these two pieces and click the Assign Material button and take a look, see what we got. Okay, fair enough. That's good enough for now. Maybe we want to adjust a little bit. Looks like it's getting a little bit stretched here, but that's okay. And maybe that's a little too, tore up there. It's a little stretched there too, so we'll take a look at that. What we can do is we can close this, and we can turn on edged faces again. So I'm going to pick that little guy, and I'm going to add another modifier here. So edit poly, and I'm going to pick faces. There we go. And what I can do is, again, add this UVW map modifier. And here what I'll do is I'll say, okay, go and do it along Y, along X. That's the right one. Let's say I will hit the fit button, and that gives me what I had before because it was about right. But what I'm looking to correct here is that stretch. Now, there's a couple of places that I can correct that stretch, actually. One of the places is in the bitmap itself. The bitmap itself has this parameter called tiling, in which I can set it to tile in UNV. So I can just move these around. So tiling, let's set this to 1 and 1.2. I can tile it in one direction or another. And so I can sort of, if it's a tiling texture map, I can have it repeat a number of times, 2.5 times in this case, which takes care of some of the stretching. But it also makes it repeat other places that maybe I don't want it to repeat, like here, for example. This is especially, it's especially poor to do this in a material that's a generic material like this. It's something applied to several things. You don't want to, in order to fix one thing, you don't want to break another thing, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to leave tiling to 1 and 1 here in the bitmap itself. And what we'll do is we'll increase the tiling in this particular UV mapping coordinate. So what I can do is just increase V tile here and move this around until it's not quite so stretched out anymore. And that way I haven't affected any of the other things that material is assigned to, or that texture is assigned to. Now I actually don't really like how chewed up that thing is, so I'm going to go into Photoshop and I'm going to take out some of those little bits. You got this already got some noise here, and it's going to want to give the eye a rest someplace. So go into Photoshop, and it's actually really easy to do. If you take the stamp tool, the clone stamp tool, and you turn off aligned, then you can pick an area, and when you do that, it's always going to clone from that area that you've just picked. So we take out some of this. We can leave in the little things. I just kind of want to get rid of some of this big stuff. It's just a little bit too, over the top with how chewed up it is. So now I'm going to take this new map and map it to those bits where I don't need quite as much, chippedness. So So in order to do that, I'll get the material editor up here, and what I'll do is I'll take this material and copy it. But I can't do that right now because I'm in rotate mode, so I'm going to right click and say drag copy rather than drag rotate. So I drag copy, and when I drag it, I can copy it over to here. Now, it's kind of important to, when you do that, you'll see generic paint, and then you'll see generic paint. Not a bad idea to kind of rename this and call it, generic paint less hacked. Because what's going to happen is if I don't do that and I leave it this way and I change it, so I'm going to change this and pick trailer paint less hacked, right? So if I do that, then I have that new material here, and then if I try to take this piece and apply this with the assigned material, it's going to ask me replace it or rename it. If I select replace, what it's going to do is it's going to replace everything that had this material assigned to it with that material, and that's not what I want to do. You can rename that material in this dialog box, but it's not a bad idea to do it beforehand. But at any rate, either way, then it'll rename that material for you, so you can have you can have one of each, and that's a little bit better. It's not quite so ridiculously scratched up there. So 3D Studio Max actually makes it really convenient for you to share materials between scenes. And you do that with this thing called a material library. Now, if we go over to this get material, we'll see that we have all sorts of different ways to get a material with this material map browser. We can grab a new one, which we may have seen before. If you grab all of it, you can grab any one of 3D Studio's default new materials or textures. Materials come in as a little blue ball, and textures come in as a green little parallelogram there. And you grab ray trace, shellac, standard. You can browse this by thumbnail and name, or just thumbnail, which is a bad idea usually, or a big thumbnail and name. I don't usually, especially with materials, because if you look, it'll show you a material preview here, and they really don't really have much to say. The only thing that looks anything like what it is really is ink and paint and standard maybe. So anyway, I very rarely use the previews, especially with materials. But so you can get a new one. You can browse stuff that exists in the scene. You can browse what you have selected in the scene. We'll look at that again in a second. You can browse active slot, which I don't really ever use. Material editor, something that's in here, even any of the 1 through 24 slots. You can really only have 24 slots in the material editor. It doesn't mean you can only have 24 materials in the scene. You can have as many as you want. It's just you can be sort of actively looking at 24 in these little previews at any one time. Or you can browse from a material library. Now, we don't have a material library yet, so there's nothing to browse from, but we're going to make one now. So just get the material map browser up. You can also get it from the rendering menu material map browser, or you can I always just hit the get material button here. And then what you can do is you can take these materials that you've already made in one scene or another and save them out to a file so you can bring into another scene, just like importing, exporting objects, that sort of thing. But you can do a bunch of materials in one library. So we're going to take this material here and wheel paint, and I'll use this button, which is put to library. And it'll give me a chance to rename it if I really want to, but I don't really need to. I'm just going to call it wheel paint. And put wheel paint in there, and then we're going to put frame rust in there, so put to library. Okay, I'm going to put this material in, put to library, good. And I think just this one, and that's fine. So we have 4 materials in there, and they give you a little preview as well of those materials that you have made. This little checkbox here will, if you uncheck it, root only means it'll just show you essentially the material that's at the top of the hierarchy. If you uncheck it, it'll show you everything that's within the hierarchy, so you can browse any maps or submaterials that you have that are part of this material and its hierarchy. What you can do in the material map browser, right here, you have File. You can save as. And what we'll do is we'll save this as, and it'll come up in a folder called Material Libraries in whatever project you have. Or you can save it wherever you want. You don't have to put it there. You can save it on your desktop if you really want. It doesn't really matter, but we're going to call it trailer.mat is a default extension. So we save that, and it'll show up right here, trailer mat. And we can open it with in any other file, and whether it has anything to do with the trailer or not, and share these materials that we've made. Okay, so what we'll do is we can close this and close that, and then we'll just grab that our file that we were working on, and we can just start assigning. So right here, we'll take this. Now, I picked the frame, but I don't want to start assigning materials yet because otherwise I'm going to assign a material to everything. What you don't want to assign material to the whole group in this case. We want to assign materials to components. So we have to go to Group, Open. We open that up, and then we can pick just the frame. So now we get our material editor up here, and we have a couple empty slots here. So I'm going to get material, and if I haven't restarted Max, if it's the same 3D Studio Max session, it'll just show up with whatever I had picked last, material library, and with the material library that I have loaded at the time. If I restart Max, I'm probably going to have to go in File, Open, and browse it to wherever it is on disk, open it up, and say, double click it, open, then I have it. I have this material library loaded. You can have as many material libraries as you want. You can have metals, cloths. You can have metal and cloth in one. You can have one according to character. It doesn't really matter how you save them out. You can have whatever makes sense to you. But you can only have one loaded at any one time. So you open, save them. You can merge two together if you want to with the merge button. That will bring in a new material library, and while leaving the same one intact. But then if you save it, you'll overwrite whatever is picked here. Okay, so anyway, now you can, if you say get material, you're in a slot, and you say get material, and material map browser pops up. You can get a material by double clicking it, and it'll put it in the slot, the currently active slot. Or even easier, you can just take it here and drag and drop it into the material slot. So drop it into there, and we'll scroll over one, drop it into there, and we have our 4 materials that we can use. So what we'll do, take that frame, we have it picked. This is frame rust, so I'm going to assign it, and there we go. Now this frame rust is particular to this frame because if I look in the bitmap, it's tiled 8 times. What that's doing is, since this is a pretty long object, I just thought, well, it looks better if it's tiled 8 times across there. That way it doesn't stretch in one direction. So this rust isn't really that useful to put onto other things, because like if I grab this, or even better, if I grab, let's grab these axles here. If I grab these axles and assign that material to them, then it's repeating 8 times across the axles, and that's not really a good idea. It doesn't look good. So what we'll do is we'll make a copy of this thing. So by dragging and dropping, you can copy that material. Now, if I can drag it to an empty slot like here. I can also drag it to a slot that exists. Even, you see these little triangles, remember from before, these little triangles mean that material is assigned to something. If the triangle is solid white, it means the material is assigned to whatever's selected. So if I select this, or if I select this here, so let's open that group as well, select this one, and then that means that material is assigned to that thing. If I drag and drop this, copy that material, it doesn't overwrite that material in the scene. You see that material is fine. That object is fine. It just overwrites it in the slot. These slots are just for preview, so you don't have to worry about stomping over materials in your scene. They'll always exist. They'll be fine. The only time you stomp over materials is if you put the material to a scene or overwrite it, and it'll give you a dialog box asking you if you want to apply it to the scene, overwrite that material or not. So anyway, in this case, it's fine. I've just made a copy of that material. And I can always get this material back in the preview slots here if I just click on an empty slot, or any other slot for that matter. It doesn't really matter. Click on an empty slot, and then I can either use this Get Material button, so Get Material, and then I come down here and I hit Selected. That will allow me to get that material off of that object and put it into the slot that's selected. Or even better than that, you can use the little eyedropper tool. And the eyedropper tool will pick that material, pop it into that slot of whatever you eyedropper over. So that's a really nice way to be able to pick materials. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to take these guys here, and I'm going to work on that new rust. So instead of frame rust, I'm going to call this generic rust. Okay, And that generic rest, I'm going to go in and edit that bitmap so that it doesn't tile 8 times, so that it just tiles once. So these tilings are where you can set that. So tile one time, that's it. And then I'll take that material and apply it to those things. And now it's not repeating 8 times, which works for this, but doesn't work for these. So I can take that generic rest and apply it to whatever else I want to. That apply it to this thing, whichever. So what I'll do, I'm going to take this material and I'm going to assign it to that. Just keep assigning away here. And a lot of times what I like to do is rough in some material. So I'll put this on there as well. And that's fine. I don't know, it seems a little bit busy for this. I really made that material for the chain. It's a little bit busy for this thing, but I can always, I'll see how it looks in render. So like if I take this thing and hit render, maybe it's going to work great. And it actually doesn't look too bad, so maybe I'd be happy with that. But I kind of like to rough in materials because then sometimes you can put a rough material on there, and in context, it actually works better than you thought. So it's not a bad idea to rough in stuff. You might be able to save yourself some work at some point. All right, now I want to concentrate on these rivets here. And what I could do if I wanted to assign a material to them is I can go in and control pick each one of them, but that would be a hassle. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to, with something that's has a lot of them like this, you want to really deal with them as either a group or by name. And unfortunately, I didn't apply a naming convention to these. I should have. If I take my own advice, I should have. The very first one that I created, I should have called it Rivet 1 or Rivet 0 and then multiplied them. But I didn't do that, so now they're all called sphere blah, blah, blah. So what I can do is I can go in here and pick all the sphere, blah, blah, blahs, just control clicking them. Or I can go in and go sphere, pick all the sphere, pick anything with sphere in its name in the scene. So I click OK. And for this scene, it works out okay because there was nothing else that started out with the word sphere. So that's all right. It's fine to do that. However, if I had not established a very good naming convention, I built tons of things out of spheres, I'm going to pick all of that stuff in doing this. So you can see already that even just working by yourself, establishing a naming convention can help you. And if you work with other people, you're really going to want to pay attention to a good naming convention. So having said that, now we can go in and clean this up a little bit. It's not too hard, fortunately. So we just go Tools, Rename Objects, and then I'll give it a base name, and I'll just call it Rivet. Okay, and then numbered, so I increment the number, starting at 0, incrementing by 1. Hit rename, and then we'll see that each one of those is called Rivet something or other. Now, when I go in here and I say just pick Rivet, I know that I'm just going to be picking the rivets, and I'm not accidentally, picking willy-nilly tons of other things called something else. So if I establish a good naming convention, I can pick things far easier. Okay, now I could group those together if I wanted to, et cetera, kind of like we did with the chain. But what I'm going to do is just leave it, go over here and assign that generic rest to them. So it makes it a lot easier to pick things in the scene. Now, I can deal with these chains. Now the chains, I said, you wanted to, in order to assign a material to things, you wanted to ungroup them. Well, I want to assign the same material to every link of the chain, so I don't need to ungroup that. So I just pick the entire group and assign the material to it. Now we're going to look at these wheels. So let's take a look at these and do the same thing where we open the group. So it'll turn pink. We can still pick the group by picking the corner there, but we can have access to each individual piece of it as well. Let's start out with, well, first we can start out with the lugs here. So those lugs are also groups, but that's okay. We just want to put the generic rest on each one of those. So get the materials, put generic rest on there. Great. Now you notice that these wheels were actually instances, so it's not picking up the material that I just assigned, even though this wheel is an instance of this wheel here. So we might want to, you can approach that a couple of different ways. First of all, you can open each group. If you had a lot of instances, though, that would get, even 4, it would be kind of a pain to do that. So what I'll just end up doing is delete these other pieces. and then re-instance them. You could potentially go in and, as you model it, assign a placeholder material to each piece. That way, when you instanced it and you applied a material, or you edited the placeholder material for each one, then it would update on each one because they already had the material assigned. So you could, if you have some, you know, foresight, you could do that. Unlike me, but I'll just go in and I'm actually going to take each one of these out, and I'm just going to delete them. Then we'll re-instance them once this one is fully has materials applied to it. Okay, so what we'll do is now concentrate on the rim portion of it. And I already made a material for that and imported it from that material library. And you can sort of see that the UVs are real screwed up on this thing. So if we zoom in a little bit and take a look, you see, well, it's kind of okay for one piece of the pie. Remember, we modeled this in sections, but the other sections didn't fare so well. So we need to do something about that. And so if we look at our modifier list here, we get a whole rundown of what we've done to it. Now, if you put a UV map modifier on here, it will apply that UV map modifier only to whatever sub-selection you have. So what I tend to do is put another edit poly modifier over the top of it, one that's set to be the root level as opposed to some sub-selection of it. And, you know, that's just me. You don't have to do it necessarily if you know, like, for example, there was no sub-selection here, but at the same time, it doesn't really hurt. So what I do, put an edit poly modifier on it, make sure there's no active sub-selection, and then go down and do a UVW map on it. And you see by doing that, then what we've got is, by default, it's projecting along the z-axis, local z. So if we say, well, you know, right now our axis is set to local. So if we go to, or excuse me, set to view. So if we go to local, now we'll see, yep, indeed, that's z. So if we want to get a sense of what axis would be better to align to, we can hit X, and then it'll align to X, and then we can hit fit. All right, so that fits that map to the extent of whatever we've got selected. So that seems to work out pretty good. You'll notice, though, that since it's taking that and projecting planarly along like this view, well, it looks good, and it looks good from here, and the map flows. It's just, that's the bitmap, and it is projected straight across into this thing. But since this thing has some slight concavities and some sort of ins and outs there, along those parts where you're only getting a small portion of the map, it gets stretched. So that can be a thing that you'll have to watch out for. Now, you'd have to edit the UVs of this thing manually in order to get around that. And you would do that by going to this unwrap UVW modifier. And what that does is if you put that unwrap UVW modifier on there and hit edit, you get this edit UVs window. And now this would look familiar to you if you've ever done UVs in another application. This is how most apps deal with UVs. Okay, you have to edit sort of the UV map. This is the unwrapped in 2D version of what I've just done. All right, and it allows you to edit individual edges UVs. You can pick by vertex, edge, or face along there, and you can edit the specific UVs. You can expand their texture coordinates by hitting the scale button here, and then you scale them up. That gives a certain number of faces more UV space. This is something that we're not going to get into in here in this intro. We can cover that in a later sort of more advanced UV editing topic. For now, just know that you sometimes will need to edit UVs in this way, and this is why people, including me, dislike UVs so much, is because this part of it is so unrewarding, but yet you have to have them in order to draw textures properly. And even in the case of simple objects, sometimes, they won't get drawn properly. This is probably okay. Are we going to notice it? Maybe not that much. If we got really in close to it, yeah, we would have to edit the UVs for this thing. So, but again, let's save that for a later discussion. We'll worry about simple UV mapping right now, so we don't need to get into it too much. So I'll get rid of that UV unwrap modifier. Okay, so that's working pretty good. So I'm going to take this tire and let's get a new material for it. So we'll do this. We'll call it tire. Okay, now we have we're going to map it with a bitmap. I'm going to just pick this bitmap, and I made I've got a tire here. It has a wheel on it, but that's okay. We're just going to use the tire portion of it. Show that in the viewport here, and assign to the tire. I'll make sure I pick the tire, and assign it. And you see, well, that's not drawing on there right at all. So what we need to do is we need to adjust the UVs of this thing. Right. So what we'll do is grab this modifier list. We're going to do UVW map, of course. So come up with our planar mapping like we had before. Now we can go in and we can go ahead and do align it to one of the edges, one of the axes of it. Or we can do this normal align thing, of course, but it doesn't really work for a tire, but you can see what normal align is doing. It's just aligning itself to whatever direction the face of that that current face is pointing out. So normal align. Or we can, come in a little bit more like this and do a view align, which will align it, and then a fit, which will, that's roughly it. Align it to our camera view. But it's going to be a little bit wonky over here, so maybe that's not the best way to align it. So what we'll do is if we come down here to an ortho view in the right, and then we hit view align again and fit, and then we look in our perspective view again, now it's going to be perfectly straight up and down. Okay, so you can also reset it if you get real squirrely with it, like if you do a normal align and it gets all goofy. You can hit reset and then it'll default to where it was, and then you can go along, like in this case it looks like it's the X axis, and then hit fit again. So there's numerous options in here for dealing with this. Now, so that's fine. That works out great. And then we can go in and adjust our with a tire. We can adjust the material parameters of it. Probably going to need to increase the spec level of it and maybe take the glossiness down a little bit. And we'll rotate this around and see what that looks like. That looks rubbery. So that's good. What we'll do then is we want to put a tread on this, because that's what it's doing, since it's using a UV map that is planar along this axis. It's just projecting straight through and stretching all this business out. And that's not really working very well. So what we need to do is we need to assign a separate material to just those faces that correspond to the tread rather than the edge. And you can do that in 3D Studio by going to the modifier list and hitting an Edit Mesh. There's a couple of different ways to do it. You can do Edit Mesh, or you can do Mesh Select. I'm going to use Edit Mesh because it's kind of the simplest way to do it. So I'm going to say Edit Mesh, and that'll allow me to pick faces. And so I'll go and pick those faces. I'll pick them in this front view here, and let's say I just want to pick, what is it, these ones. That looks pretty good. So just pick those faces. That'll correspond to the tire tread. And what I'm going to do is come down here, and I'm going to assign this to a material ID of 2. So what that means is this one I'm going to assign what's called a multi-material. And a multi-material is just that. It is one material with multiples, and it uses this thing called a material ID to distinguish between them. Okay, so this will be clear when I open the material editor. And what I'll do is I have my tire material, and I'm going to click on this standard button. This is going to allow me to switch types. So I hit standard, and then I'm going to switch it to a multi-sub-object type. Hit OK. It'll ask me this question: discard the old material or keep the old material? Well, I want to keep the old material. And so right now I have 10 slots. I have 10 things that this material could be. Okay, so the first one is a tire. And you see there's multiple names here, and this name is internal to the multi-material. They don't have to be the same, but if you want to call it, if I call it something, I very often call it the same. But you could be like metal, and then you could call it a specific piece of metal, like a screw, or then this one might be a bolt or something else. And even though they have the same actual material, so there's multiple ways to use this, but I often just call them the same things. Again, if I use this at all. But at any rate, now I can have 10 materials. I don't really need 10. I only need 2, really. So I'm going to set number and I'm going to set this number down to 2. So now I just have 2 materials that I could possibly have on this object. And what it's done is it's taken this, and what I need to do is if you pick on any individual face, it will read out right here what its material ID is. Okay, so right now I have material ID of 2 on the tread and actually 3 on the rest of the stuff. Now that's going to work out okay if I go into the material and I say tire. The reason it stopped drawing is because whenever you change material types, it turns off these the show button. So if I turn it back on, you see, oh, it still is the tire, even though its material ID for all those faces is 3. I don't have 3 submaterials of this thing. What 3D Studio does is if it has a material ID that's more than materials in the submaterial, it just wraps around. So it goes 1, 2, and then 3, and wraps back around to this one. Well, and it works. It would render fine. It would work fine. But if I add another material to this, all of a sudden I'm going to be getting something screwball. Now something that isn't what I want. So again, it's probably better to show good form and then set these material IDs to 1. So I can do that by using this select ID, and it'll select all faces on that object that have material ID 3, and then I can set their material ID back down to 1. So now it's correct. So now if I look at this, I have nothing that's green. It's all either the tire or the tread. And then this one doesn't have anything to do with anything. So I can just hit delete. I can either set number back down to 2, or I can pick that material and hit delete. And that way I have material ID and whatever they are. So now this new material in here, I'm going to pick it. Actually, what I might want to do is copy this material. So say copy. And that way it's the tire again, but it's a copy of it. So what I'll do is I'll take the bitmap off of it, but what that's done is it's given me the same specular level and glossiness settings, so they'll match across material IDs. And now, but I want to edit this color, so we'll zoom this a little bit and then pick a color that more closely matches. The gray is not doing it, so that matches whatever that should be. So something like that. Fine, that's good. Something like that. And now I have one material here, another material here. So what I'll do is I can assign a new color map to that, but what I really want to do is assign a bump map to it, a bump map that looks like tread. So I can take this bump map, and I'll pick a bitmap, and then I have a tire tread down here. So I pick that, and I'm going to elect to show this map in the viewport. Now, it's not going to show as bump, it's going to show as color, but that's useful for me visualizing it anyway. So what I'll do is I'll pick that, and you can see it's drawing on real screwy, even if I change the tilings or whatever, because it's using those same UVs that it had before, those UVs that are stretched all the way through this region of the object, and that's not correct. So what we need to do is we need to re-UV map that section of that object. So I'm going to take my edit mesh here, and I'm going to select by ID. So I'm going to pick ID 2. I'm going to select all the faces that have ID 2. Now all those faces are picked, and I'm going to apply a UVW map modifier to it, and it'll apply that UV map modifier only to those faces. Now I have a planar picked, and that's not quite right. It looks maybe a little bit better here, but it's stretching here. So what I want to do is that's most like a cylinder. So I'm going to change that to be a cylindrical type. And that cylindrical type, I can either rotate it around. If I open this up and pick the gizmo, I can use any of these transform tools to move it around, including rotate. So I can do it like that. I can transform it freely. Or I come down here, hit reset, and then just pick the right axis. So again, it looks like, if we do here, it looks like X. So line to X, well, that's not quite right because we're in view mode. You see the X doesn't, that's not local X, that's view coordinate system X. We want the object's local coordinate system, so it's actually Y. So we're going to pick Y, and then it's cylindrically mapped around Y in that way, and then we just hit fit. And that way, it's going to map the tread to the tread image to that region that we want to be the tread in a cylindrical fashion. So come up here and go back to our materials, and then we can set set the tiling in UNV, and let's say we do like 10 repeats. That seems pretty good. Maybe not quite 10, maybe 8. And it's going to repeat 8 times around here. And so that bump mapping, now it's drawing on like that. It's not going to render like that because it's just a bump map after all. So if I do hit render on this, you can see I've got bumps. And let's increase the amount of bump and just see. You can go up to whatever number you want in bump. We'll just hit render and see. Yeah, that probably is about right. So we'll just leave it at that. But if I wanted to, I could come in here, go into this, and under the output, hit invert. And when I do that, it's going to invert how the bumps show up. So now that tread is going in. But again, it's not. It's going the correct way at this point. So move it like that, and there we go. Now we have that tire texture mapped. Now on the wheel cap here, I'm going to go in and create something relatively simple. I'm just going to create a chrome shader for it. So I'll open up my material editor, go over here to an empty slot. I'll call this chrome and assign it. And it's not going to look any different, so I need to do something to it. So a chrome shader, the diffuse goes black, and specular level goes up high, and glossiness goes down low. Specular level, right here, this little graph will give you an idea of what the specular highlight looks like. So it's dark, 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 dark. Peaks very bright. Peaks, drops off, dark, dark, dark. So that's the spec highlight as is drawn here. Now if I take glossiness, specular level all the way up, it'll peak it there. But I can go beyond 100 and it'll cap it. So that makes a nice way to do like a glossy reflective metal that has highlights that are crisp. Is by cranking spec level past 100. And then I go in and I'm going to add a reflection map to this. So I'm going to add this as a bitmap. And you can use all kinds of bitmaps as a reflection map. This is a very common one, this Lake 3. I think comes with 3D Studio. You can use it. I'm going to use it right now as a generic one. But if we do all formats here, there's also another one which here, this yellow terrain, that's a good one. It'd be like we're on Mars. If you use that as a reflection map, you get this. Now, this Lake 3 one is a good generic bitmap, even though the yellow terrain is a true full unwrap, or more like it anyway. This Lake 3 is just a picture, so it's not a true unwrap, so it doesn't give the most accurate reflections. But it's kind of nice because it does give a little bit of color into reflections, and it does look very chromy when you put it on stuff. Now this may not work as I take this trailer and put it into a scene, because the scene might not have anything to do with this. It might not be mountains and a lake and a sky that looks like that. It might be blue. It might be green or pink or whatever the sky is. It might not have anything to do with that. So I could change the reflection map out later on. It's fine, but it's good to get a placeholder on there at the very least right now. When you get it into the scene, you can go ahead and change it out. So I put the reflection map on there. Now it's important that, well, if you use a reflection map, if you map something to reflection, 3D Studio will automatically choose environment for you as opposed to texture. You don't want to choose texture because if you rotate this around, now that environment is stamped onto the object. And as this wheel turns, the horizon of the environment is going to spin around along with the wheel. And you don't want that. So that's where this special mapping type of environment comes in handy. And what that'll do is it'll map this that picture out to a virtual sphere. And as the wheel rotates around, it's going to stay locked solid. So it'll just be making pretend reflections in there. And there's all these different types of environment mapping: cylindrical, shrink wrap, or screen. This is the most common, spherical. You use it 90% of the time. So we can get into these in a later sort of session. But spherical for the basics right now, 90% of the time you're good. All right, so now that's going to be in as our reflection map. And you can change the amount of reflectivity down a little bit. For something like chrome, though, you want it pretty much all the way up. So this is a good chrome shader. Low diffuse, high reflection, sharp spec. Okay, and now rendering that, we get chrome. Okay, chrome and on our wheel there. So now, pretty much, I think that's it. All we need to do is take this, hold down Shift, be in the move mode, hold down Shift, and clone it out. Although I didn't pick the whole thing, I need to pick the group, hold down Shift, move it, and clone that wheel. And I'll do an instance so that if I make changes to it, it'll update, although the materials won't necessarily. Now the materials will update because I have made an initial assignment, and so now they will. But I'm going to pick the other one, go out like this, move that over, hit instance again, and then I can rotate these around. Angle snap is on, so I know I just do uh, 180. Come on. There we go. 180, and then move them in just a touch. And there we go. So a couple more simple material assignments and tweaks, and I think we're finished. So whenever you're finished, or even as you're working, you want to take a look at this thing rendered, but you don't want to you want to be sure that you render it in a relatively what we would call neutral light setup. You don't want to render it over white. You don't want to render it over black. You want to render it over mid-gray with some kind of appropriate lighting, so that you're looking at the true colors of it, so that you can tell if it was going to work with other items or not. And it just gives you a good sense. It's kind of satisfying anyway. A good sense of what what you've built looks like. So a really easy way to do that is to create a plane here. So I'm going to create this plane. It doesn't really matter what the length and width are, because of course I can set them to be whatever I want at any time in the parameters here. But I'm also going to center it a little bit, just because. And then you go to the Modify panel, and you see, we could set this to be 5,000 if we wanted to, if we wanted the plane to shoot out to, almost infinity. But one of the aspects of plane is that there's this attribute called scale. So you can go ahead and set that scale, and you can make the scale 10 times whatever it is. Now it's only a render multiplier, so it doesn't change anything in the viewport here. It just renders this 10, 20 times as big. So you can go ahead and just use that, and then you have a sort of a smaller plane to manage. You don't have this huge thing going off into 10,000 units into the scene here. So we have our plane, and we need to assign. I'll go over here, drop down to just some mid-gray material. Make sure that this material is mid-gray. They don't quite start off at mid-gray. It kind of looks mid-gray, but it's not really. Mid-gray is 128. So that's mid-gray. Hit OK, and you can call this ground. And then assign it to that plane. Now, next step is you go to the rendering menu. And in the rendering menu, there's this thing called environment. You go into environment, and you'll see background color. It's black by default. You actually want to look at these things over mid-gray as well. So you can change value up here to 128. Hit OK. And then if you render this, well, okay, so it's not, the environment color is not really agreeing with this ground color. It says ground color is getting shaded by this default light source. So it's not really, this is true mid-gray. This isn't quite yet. But when we add in a light, it will be. So we can add in this thing called a skylight. And the skylight is really cool because it allows you to create light that comes evenly from all around. Now just make sure that the multiplier is 1, that the color is white, okay? And you want to turn on cast shadows. Now it defaults to 20 here, but you can set it to be 5 to preview, maybe 10 to preview, and then back to 20 when you do a final render. Now this definitely is not the cheapest way of doing this. The renders take a little bit of time, to be honest, because it's shooting a lot of rays here and doing a lot of shading, but it does look nice, and it's not like I said, it's not the most efficient, but it is the easiest. So it's a good way to start. And then you can also create a free direct. So I'm going to create that directional light in here. I can move it up and then rotate it around so that it's, pointing some, roughly 45-degree angle to my thing there. And you can go in there, and if your multiplier is 1 or whatever, you're probably going to want to take this down to 0.6 or 0.5 or something in that neighborhood, because you have that skylight. Now it can be a combination between the skylight and this direct light. I kind of find that I like the skylight being at 1 and the directional light being at 0.5. Anyway, make the color white, and if you have in the directional parameters, if your cone is small here, what you can do is, it depends on whatever object you've made, but may or may not be, but you just want to ensure that that cone is big enough to encompass your object. And you can even pull the hot spot in a little bit, so you have a little bit of fall off between these two regions. Whatever. You make like a kind of a nicer fall off here. And then you can hit render. Make sure that this thing is casting shadows. Turn them on. You can use shadow maps or ray trace shadows, whichever one you like. For now, ray trace is a little bit simpler. It's not something that we've gotten into so much, the differences. And then what I'll do is go over to my skylight here, and probably have to pick by name. And if sometimes 3D Studio is a little bit fussy. It always kind of wants to pick that ground plane. Now, one thing that you can do, one way that you can get around that is you can go through here and you can select what it is you're picking. So you pick just lights, and then that makes it easier. You can also go into the select from scene and turn everything off, and then turn lights back on and pick that way. So either way, right now I'm going to make sure that my raise per sample is up to 20, and that gives a nice neutral render of this thing. And it is, what's good about the combination of lights is you get a nice shadow, but you also get these nice soft diffuse shadows, and so that really helps to solidify the thing. Well, that shadow modeling really gives a sense of the form of it, and at the same time it's under neutral lighting here. So it's a good way for you to visualize, what the true colors of your object are, while at the same time casting some nice shadows and stuff.